going to be doing something different here. We're going to be looking at this old book from 1870. I believe it may have been republished. It's hard for me to tell, but it's could be an 1898 version as well. So that said, I would like to talk to you about a little bit of the history of this book, and maybe we could talk about the history of books at this time. So we're just gonna light this candle here. So it has a tobacco scent that I really like, and I'd add some candlelight while we look at this book a little bit closer here. So let's open this here. Right over here. And now we have that lit. We can go ahead and take a closer look at this book here. So the first thing you can see is that it is quite old. So some of the colors have faded a little bit. But why don't we just take a step back and talk about books in general. So at the dawn of the printing press, there was about 15 million books. So, a century after that was 200 million. And by the time this book was printed, it was 1 billion printed books. So it's just amazing how fast, this kind of published work was circulated, and kind of explains the speed of advancement, because the knowledge was shared that much faster. So with the continued spread of the written word, along with the growth of education and the reduction in print costs, we saw the first mass market paperbacks. So, for example, in Britain, there were two markets these publications were aimed at. Story papers for the juvenile market, and Penny Dreadful, which was aimed at the adult working class. Eventually, these novels were exclusively aimed at the working class youth market, and that sort of became interchangeable with the term Penny Dreadful as we know it today. So, in general, these stories were printed on cheap pulp paper and often ran as like episodic or featured series. America also started to have a big influence on British culture during this time. We're in 1870, and many of these stories were being shown in England like Wild West literature and things of that nature. So often this younger working class couldn't afford a penny a week, so they would team up with friends and buy these books and stories and create book clubs and reading clubs. And for For the more business savvy, they might even rent these out for a fee to their friends. In the United States, these were known as dime novels, and often they would run for many issues in a magazine or a newspaper. So a lot of these works are compilations of these printed publications, and it was sort of right around this time that hardcover books became more common, and paperback became more low class. So a lot of these books were converted to hardcover, which kind of explains this book right here. So let's talk about the author of this book, William Taylor Adams. He was a noted academic author and member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So he actually wrote under a pseudonym, which is the author of this book. It says it here. I'm not sure if you can see that, but it says Oliver Optic. Sort of faded there, but that was one of his pen names. I think he had a few others. He wrote many, many stories. So I went ahead and looked up some information, and I found, according to the New International Encyclopedia, which was written in 1905, so it was a source very close to the time. William Taylor Adams is an American educator and writer of juvenile fiction, popularly known as Oliver Optic. He was born in Medway, Massachusetts. For 20 years, he taught in the Boston public schools. And for 14 years, he was a member of the Dorchester School Committee, and he was once elected to the legislature. He wrote more than 100 volumes of juvenile fiction, which contained, in large part, to Oliver Optic's magazine, of which he was the editor. So, as I mentioned previously, with a lot of these kind of books, these stories appeared in a series, of which many of the popular ones were The Boat Club, Young America Abroad, The Starry Flag, Onward and Upward, and The Yacht Club. And he also published 2 novels, The Way of the World and Living Too Fast. So, extensive travel abroad and a deep knowledge of boats, farming, and practical mechanics were other factors that really gave William Taylor Adams reality. So at first he began to write at the age of 28, and he published under the pseudonym of Warren T. Ashton. But it was mostly, it was only a modest success, so he tried again, and he had his first real hit, which was called the Boat Club series, and it was sort of a combination of different stories set in the Civil War. So overall, he wrote 100 books, and most of them for a younger male audience, as you can see here on the side of this book. There's sort of a young man here, and it says American Boys Series. Not sure how much you can see that, but so this is a book that was intended for young men at that time. As I mentioned, that was one of the main audiences, so that's why he sort of focused on that audience, and that Oliver Optic pseudonym was the one he used the most. So Adams wrote over 100 books. Most of them were for a younger male audience, as I mentioned. That was one of the main audiences, and as you can see here, there's a young guy here, and it says American Boys Series. So I mentioned it was, a lot of these books were written in magazines. His was Oliver Optic magazine, and he published these as a series, so you could think of your favorite magazine that has a recurring story. And that kind of might explain it. So he had used Oliver Optic the most, but he was also an editor, and he had many other pseudonyms. Irving Brown, Clingham Hunter, MD, and Old Stager. William Taylor Adams characters, they traveled a lot. They're usually well-mannered, athletic, and patriotic. And the stories are laced with a strong moral. So, they were popular with girls, but they were rarely characters in the book, which is fairly reflective of the time period and previous time periods, frankly, unfortunately. So, that kind of leads to maybe one of the critics of Adams, which is that these are careless. It's kind of careless writing. It's really about the vivid narrative and less about the arc of the story and the depth of the story. So, as I understand it, he wrote stories that reflected the times, but probably held off on critiquing that reality to some degree. But let's open up this book and look further inside, because I think that might be really interesting too. So, as you can see here, this is, it says James, I want to say Warwick, 6106. Can't read that. Man, it looks like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, shout out to James from 1870, or late 1800s James. And the paper is just very, very thick and has that old book smell, which I think is really pleasant. So this was a series of stories, as I mentioned. This one was the Upward and Onward series. You can see here, this looks like there's 6 of them. And we can see here, set that down there. It says Field and Forest, The Fortunes of a Farmer, which is or, so it does have 2 titles. And it says by Oliver Optic, author of the Young American Abroad, and 14 illustrations, of which one is right here. So, take a look at this. Not sure if I can get a good shot of that, but there it is right there. Something like a Davy Crockett kind of scene, in my opinion. And we can see here, this is pretty interesting here. It says, entered according to the Act of Congress in the year 1870 by William T. Adams in the office of the Library of Congress. Copyright 1898. So it does look like this may be a 1898 copy of this 1870 book. So that's my excellent young friend Charles H. Fowle. So shout out to him as well. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just flip through some of this here and maybe read a little bit. Preface, here's Field and Forest is the first of the Upward and Onward series, in which the career of a youth from his childhood to manhood is illustrated and described. In following out the plan which the author adopted when he began to write books for the young, and which he has steadily pursued in the 50 volumes now before the public, he has endeavored to make his hero a young man of high aims and lofty purposes. However strange, stirring, or even improbable his adventures might seem, Phil Farringford, the leading character of this series, though always honest, true to principle, and faithful to the light which he seeks in the gospel and all other sources of wisdom, he aims to be a Christian young man, respects and loves all the institutions of religion, and labors to make his life an upward and onward progress. So a very wholesome young guy, which again, during this time was more common to see, in my opinion, compared to maybe some of the postmodern writing that you see later on in the 19th century. So we can see here chapter 1, in which Phil comes home with plenty of fish, page 11. Chapter 2, in which Phil finds the camp of the Indians, 21. So that's a pre-PC description. I should add that. In which Phil takes good care of the horses, page 32. Chapter 4, in which Phil loses an old and valued friend, never a good thing. Chapter 5, in which Phil follows Kit Cruncher. Chapter 6, in which Phil assists in the building of a block house. Chapter 7, in which Phil and his friends guard the castle. So actually there's a lot of chapters. So let's continue along actually here, because we do have a lot of pages to get through. And just read this first page here, but Field and Forest, chapter 1. Hello, Phil, that was the name to which I answered, especially when it was spoken as decidedly as on the present occasion. I'm coming, I replied at the top of my lungs. I had been a-fishing in a stream which flowed into the Missouri about a mile above my home. I had been very successful, and as many fish as I could carry. I was gathering them up after I had fastened my bateau to the stake and intended to convey them to the castle as our log, but was rather facetiously called by its owner. Phil, Phil, repeated the voice above the bluff of the river. It was Matt Rockwood, yeah. It's a very old-fashioned American name there. We're going to just kind of glance through some more pages here, because again, it's just the paper's so beautiful, and it just has that really old book smell, so. I love some of the I never gin am none, and shan't begin now. Some of the language here is fantastic. Unfortunately, it looks like some of the pages did bend on the corner there. So it kind of, in my opinion, it feels kind of like a Boy Scout kind of story, maybe like a Hardy Boys kind of story, and before that was a popular thing. I'm going to try to get just a close-up. I mean, you can see with this paper, it's very, has some age spots, which I really like. Chapter 3. Okay. I'm just going to keep flipping through this book here. Mr. Mellowtone. That's a very nice name. You do see, just immediately here I can see, and there's some terminology that in modern times would be probably not very well accepted. Here's another illustration. We can look at that, actually. The story of Kit the Cruncher. The horses returned to their owners, page 4. 1947. Sort of some unfortunate representations of Native Americans, but that's okay. It is a historical work, so we'll take it in historical context here. But I did find some criticism of this author in the sense that, so the reality was at this time that things were not fair societally, and so while this author himself held fairly progressive views, from my understanding, some of the realities which he wrote about were not PC, and so it's important to take that into consideration, because you do see some of the tropes that some might view as offensive. So that's important to say here, because when we are viewing historical work, I think it's very important to take things as we see them at the time. So, let's see if you can look through this a little bit further here. I don't want to cause too much damage to these pages. They are very gentle. So we're just flipping through the rest of this here. And, for the most part, I think it's safe to say that this is a book that it does serve a purpose to really help people understand what young men especially at that time, were consuming. Maybe be almost like a superhero book or movie today. You can see this interesting drawing here. So it would be kind of like a movie if you think about it in that way. And you can imagine kind of sitting with your friends reading through these books here. Let's just scroll through till the end. So, Mr. Gracewood, so it does have some of those classic American names there. And just going through it all, what I can say is that it's really interesting to see these old books and to imagine the world that these people were living in, and just to see the comparisons to today, and the type of just fiction that's being created for young people. And you do kind of get that sense that it does have the same kind of vibe as what you see like in the modern times. So anyway, actually here we can see, this is really interesting. This was sort of like a advertisement for the series, The Boy Farmers, 85 copyright books for boys by noted American authors. So this must be a bunch of these style of, I guess you could just say almost Hardy Boy-esque styled books for youth at that time. And you can see a lot of the similar kind of names: Ark of Elm Island, Arthur Brown and the Young Captain. It reminds me of maybe like an R.L. Stein book or something too. There's a lot of them. Old Salamander, The Life of Admiral David Farragut. And as you can see, just this book there's a lot of H spots here. Anyway, all that said, I really appreciate you sitting with me for a little bit to talk about this book. I think it's so fascinating to see how things were at that time and just what people were reading back then. So I plan on doing the next video about The Hobbit, so another book video, ASMR, and I hope you enjoy that as well. So hope you have a really great week ahead, and that you had a really great New Year's as well. All right, thank you so much. Have a great night.